gentlemen, you might be wondering why you're here on a Pokemon Fire Red Leaf Green stream where I am doing nothing but not playing the game. In fact, I'm taking this opportunity to talk about the themes, lore, and other items that are present inside of Kanto. For while everyone else was playing a cute game about capturing critters and raising them up and doing their best Digimon meets Monster Rancher impersonation, yes, I know that it's not chronologically accurate, but bear with me here. There was actually something more going on inside of Kanto, and it's this kind of theming that Pokemon does that's not just in Gen 1, it's on all the generations up to Generation 5, and it in fact makes this cyclical formation about the central question that they're asking. For beyond the cute capture game, there is a question here. How does the future look? How does this country, how does Japan, how does, through the vehicle of the Pokemon universe, can we explore the idea of what the future should look like? How should it be presented? How should we orient ourselves around it? And I'm going to make a case over this series, hopefully this becomes a series, as to how each generation attempts to answer the question using the context of the country, Japan, that they're all made inside of, using evidence that's completely supported inside of the game and answers that interpretation. After all, this is pretty common for JRPGs for them to have one facet of the gameplay that they show you, such as Homeworld, where it's just about a kid with psychic powers going around with a home run bat. Isn't that super cool? And over time, it actually populates and fills out, and you see that beneath the veneer, beneath the surface, these are games that are written by people who are trying to say something. They're not just trying to fill your time. They're almost in like a Chiaki J. Konaka style, trying to fill in and answer a question for themselves and allow the game to explore that vehicle and answer it out broadly. So, well, let's get rid of the vagueness. What is this all about? So, Pokemon Gen 1, we all know Gen 1. You're in a Fire Red Leaf Green channel, so you know about Gen 1. Generation 1 is in Kanto, or represents the Kanto region of Japan. And all Gen 1 is about two things, and it marries these ideas beautifully. The first idea is about progress, is about the idea that you start with little and you gain more. And it talks about, explores that idea as to what is progress, how does that manifest through the game broadly, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it does answer the question of whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing by approaching its second topic, which is technology. Specifically, how should we orient ourselves around technology? A little bit of a background, you can do some more digging in this if you want, but Japan as a whole in the 90s was going through the economic miracle. This is a period that seemed impossible to post-war Japan, actually, where in the 90s, following the rebuilding of their entire government, their entire country, wrecked by a war from World War II, its impact very well known across anime, documented across all kinds of literature, as it could not hope to avoid being. Japan had this economic boom, this miracle, actually. Cars and electronics flying outside of the country, GDP going up, standard of living rising for everyone. And yet we also saw a rise in cyberpunk and in the ideas of dystopian futures and what this could look like and what the role of a corporation might be. And Generation 1 of Pokemon actually talks about both of these things, and we're going to get into it a little bit here. So we'll go through the easy part, and then we'll go through the more complicated part. So right at the very beginning of the game, we recognize that this is a game both about progression and technology for two reasons. And this is actually the introduction of all things. The few lines given by Professor Oak is actually an indication as to the stance the game takes. For after all, Professor Oak is a professor. He is a person who studies Pokemon. He is the person who gives the player their first Pokedex, which is a digital catalog of all the Pokemon in this series. He is shown first independently as a scientist and as a professor, that is his role, and then he is shown showing you Pokemon next to him. But what's important is that the intro cutscene of the game itself shows two Pokemon battling it out in kind of their natural state, right? The original is, I believe, a Nidorino, Nidorino and a Gengar. Good luck to the Nidorino in that example if you know anything about Gen 1 battling mechanics. But after it does that and you hit the start button and you see there's a picture of you as the trainer with a Pokeball, a technological device that is used to capture, maintain, and then eventually form bonds of like training and trust and improvement of all of these Pokemon, helping them to grow in a way outside of what nature would have allowed as depicted by their encounter rates and what they look like actually in the game itself as wild NPC who has wild monsters. And then it also shows a rotating cast of the Pokemon next to you. So there's this immediate harmony before we even see Professor Oak of you, the human, they, the monster or the creature or the natural order, and then the technology that is shows the cooperation between them, which is the Pokeball. Very good framing here. The next thing that we see is Professor Oak shows up by himself, indicates that he is a professor, wears the white lab coat of a professor. He is wearing the structure of the order of science, of technology. He even tells you that he studies Pokemon and that he has been doing this a long time. And then he introduces that this world is filled with Pokemon. And how does he do that? He puts another Pokemon on screen, sharing screen time, screen weight with him before it goes away. And then he resumes talking to you. Now, this is kind of the central theme, is that actually technology is a horrible master and a wonderful servant inside of Kanto. And we're going to explore that idea as a means of progress going forward. But, I'm going to just tease you with that, and then we'll come back to it. So what does the progression look like in Pokemon games? I mean, it's well documented at this point. These games are over 30 years old at this point. I mean, if they're not, then they're very close to it. So, I mean, you start with 0 Pokemon, then you get 1, then you can have a party up to 6. The ball capture spheres themselves, like the not capture spheres, Pokemon Nintendo will probably come after me for that, but the actual ball mechanic of Pokeballs they're supposed to become stronger over time. You have the Pokeball and the Great Ball and the Ultra Ball and then the Master Ball. The Master Ball is actually referenced in universe as a technology that has been developed by a corporation. Don't worry, we'll get back to that one. Even the gym leaders, this is something I don't see because it's more important in Gen 2 than it is in Gen 1, but Gen 1 fills in its progress with the gym leaders themselves. So we look at the gym leaders and they immediately, the previous gym leader is beaten in type advantage and in levels by the next gym leader. I mean, we have the very obvious first 3. We have Brock. He's weaker than Misty and has a type disadvantage against her. This same thing happens to Lieutenant Surge. This same thing then happens to Erica. Erica is then weaker than Koga. Koga is then weaker than Sabrina. Only after Sabrina does it get a little bit weird in that we have Blaine. But it's actually important if you realize that a lot of the fire-type Pokemon in Gen 1 that Blaine is using have higher attack than they have special attack. So it is meant to show the psychic psychic, specially powerful, specially potent gym leader Sabrina with her trips and tracks versus Blaine, who is using something a bit more low tech with the human element of guessing games, as opposed to Sabrina's crazy, actually corporate infused teleport system that is used in Silph Co. itself. We see Blaine just have a very quick question game, operating on similar principles, but taking it an entirely different way with Pokemon that have more attack. The fire type Blaine is then usurped by Giovanni, but it doesn't stop there. Even the Elite Four goes on from this trend. I mean, you know the games. You know what I'm talking about really well here. Lorelei is water and ice with a little bit of psychic, and then we go up to Bruno, who is fighting type, which is super effective against ice, even in this generation, and then fighting types can't hit the ghost types of Agatha. And it's only at the end that we see dragons, the mythical force, the representation of the highest peak, the greatest pinnacle, the thing that is both old and enduring. That is the thing that all things progress to as a vessel of time. All of the other things wither away and only Lance, the Dragon Champion, is left before we get to, obviously, Blue, Gary, whatever you want to call him, and then your rival, and then yourself. So the gym leaders themselves do this. Pokemon-based stat total also does this, along with route variety. This is something that I think a lot of people who make mods of the game don't quite capture or understand, is that actually in mods of Pokemon, there's this tendency, particularly when they're built for Nuzlocke, and obviously they're built for purpose, right? But I think they miss some of the charm of Gen 1, all of these remakes and attempted mods and these split versions, because they don't understand the route distribution tables. One of the most important things inside of Generation 1 is the way that the routes and the encounter rates themselves funnel you through the game. Yes, there's only 3 or 4 Pokemon inside of the first route, but more importantly, those Pokemon have only as small as 10% rates. And if you go look at speedrunners and you ask them what their average encounter rate is when they're going through, even taking maximally efficient tile sets, they can still have a certain number of encounters going up through the first route, going to grab the package, and then coming all the way back. And don't worry, we'll talk about that too. Oak's parcel, as it were. And then you see that actually there's about a 10 or sometimes 15% catch rate there, but you're supposed to have that many encounters if you're just playing the game before you come back down and you have the appropriate amount of levels. And the routes grow not only in their size, but as they grow in the size, the capture rate of said Pokemon decreases inside of them, and the number of Pokemon inside of them increase. Specifically, look at the multiplier of the smallest catch rate of Pokemon per route. The smallest catch rate of Pokemon is actually an indicator of how many encounters you should have in that route before you've mined the area out. I'll give you a very quick example. This is just a cool math thing, and then we'll go on. Let's say there's 4 Pokemon in a route, and the smallest one, they're all equitably distributed, and the smallest chance is 25%. Well, that means you should, after an average of 4 encounters, have seen each Pokemon one time, because there's 4 Pokemon, there's 100%, there's a route table of 100% on encounters, 25% split for all of them. The route is expecting you to go through and have a 25% catch rate, or a 25% rate of encountering each one. You should be able to see everything after 4 encounters. But the number, the percent of the most difficult to find Pokemon decreases over time, so that you have to be in routes longer to experience these. It becomes more of a hunt. And even this is progression, because the longer we encourage you to stay in a route, the more that you are required to have stronger Pokemon, greater tools for healing them, greater tools for healing them, greater tools for getting out of there. You go from having escape ropes to having dig to having teleport to get out of an area. So there's other places that progress happens too inside of the Pokemon world. All of this is important backdrop before we get to the technological aspect of it, right? So another thing is that people apparently are on their path to expressing or having psychic abilities. You can see this as we talk to Sabrina, and you see the various psychics that are around the area, and even some Pokemon in like Pokedex entries for Pokemon. So Sabrina says something akin to, all people have psychic abilities, they most just don't know it or hone it. And she is obviously shown, visually depicted, as having flying flying Pokeballs around her. You look at the way that Pokemon that are psychic type are represented in the game. A lot of them, listen, Pokemon is very different from Digimon. Digimon has this anthropomorphization happen, where things look cute and crittery, but they become increasingly more humanoid, right? Especially mega-level Digimon on the average, on the whole, and especially like super mega Digimon. They become more bipedal, they become less monstrous. Even the ones that are monstrous, they still have a humanoid form. Like Machine Dramon doesn't look that great, but for instance in Digimon you see like Piedmon, like just from the Dark Masters, right? Piedmon is able to go ahead and stand up. A lot of the 7 great demon lords stand. A lot of the like more cherubic looking Digimon actually stand. Pokemon doesn't do that, except for psychic types. Interestingly, we see Abra sitting on its butt and having a bipedal form but being very lazy, and then Kadabra is able to stand, and it has technology written on it itself actually, because the things that are represented on it are actually from the Zener cards. If you don't know what those are, go ahead and look them up. But it's a human-oriented experiment on whether or not psychics exist and to what extent they do, and attempts to quantify them through seeing what people can guess versus what the statistical distribution is of said guess, and then confirming whether or not there's anything statistically relevant about said interaction. You look at Hypno. Drowsy looks like a Pokemon. It looks basically like an Ekans. It looks like a Taper. That's just kind of there, and it looks a bit mythical and a bit creature-like, but it stands on 2 legs. And what's interesting is that when it becomes Hypno, it actually gains access to technology. It gains access to a pendulum that it can move sideways. It stands deliberately on 2 legs. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this, right? Primeape is obviously not a psychic type, yet it's wearing boxing gloves, right? And it's standing, and it's it's a monkey. It's like a thing that purportedly evolved into a human being, and so it looks like it has human-like traits, and it stands up. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan also, and this gets into the broader point of technology. So first we have to describe, all this progress gets into technology, so we have to describe what technology is in this framework before we can go into how it's positive, how it's negative, and how that interacts with progression. And we'll go through the story somewhat quickly, and you'll see how all of these things play out. So technology technology is not necessarily the simple example, a mechanical device that has been created by humans for the purpose of extending their functionality or their control or their locus of ability in the world. So a very simple example of technology is what Professor Oak represents. He gives you your first Pokeballs. These are things that contain Pokemon, the natural element. He also gives you a Pokedex, which is something he explicitly says that he created for the purpose of documenting all of the Pokemon in the world. Technology could also be things like the, quote, horrific gene splicing experiments that made Mewtwo. But technology is not just a thing that is humans or human invented. So things that I just mentioned earlier, fighting types actually have a great example of this. The superpower belt that Machoke wears to contain its massive power is a form of technology. It is a thing that is created as a tool to assist itself in its manipulation or its control or its navigation of the world. The boxing gloves that Mankey wears when it evolves into Primeape is also a form of technology. This is an external tool. Even the skill set, right, that we see from Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee, if we want to talk about fighting types, already gave you the example of the pendulum that is used by Hypno. You've got any number of these other Pokemon that have a technology built into them, but I want you to note, interestingly, none of the starters have that. Or do they? You could say that Blastoise's water cannons are something of its technology, but that's not an external tool that it's using. That would be like saying Rapidash is using the flames on its coat as an external tool, when that's obviously not the case, right? And so some Pokemon use tools. We can see, for instance, Farfetch'd uses a tool when it uses its leak for its leak slap, right? I mean, long before it became Surfetch'd and all of this nonsense, way back in Gen 1, it just has a leak that it uses as a stick, as a weapon, as a sword. This is very different than, say, something like Scyther, which has all of its claws and its sharp ridges built inside of its claws as parts of its natural structure. And so all of these things are technology. Any external tool that can be used to extend the locus of ability of that Pokemon, of the people in the Pokemon world, is itself a technology. So let's get into technology and why it's a great friend and a terrible master. If you've been around with me before, you're surprised that it only took me 17 minutes to get to the central conceit of the video. So let's get into some examples, right, of how technology is a great friend, right? Pokeballs, Great Balls, and Ultra Balls, specifically not the Master Ball. Great pieces of technology allow people to have some control over the natural world. Rare candies. This is something that synergizes with the Pokemon itself to increase its level. It seems to have a positive impact on the Pokemon itself. It obviously makes it stronger. These are things that you would love to have a lot of, and if you do the missing number glitch, you can have any number of them that you want, and you already know that. Let's look at some other things. But there are some things that also help the human, but don't necessarily help Pokemon, things like the Repel and the Super Repel. But we're going to get into some more specific examples about technology and how these things work together and don't, right? So let's take one example of let's take some examples of technology working together, or the absence of technology being bad, right? So here we go. We've got a little list over here. So we're going to talk about things where science wins and things where technology loses or nature wins, right? So things that show this interaction in a positive light. Professor Oak obviously stays in his lab, starts you out on your journey, helps you. He has a machine inside of his lab that can heal your Pokemon. Notice the interaction there, the positive interaction of the technology with the natural world for healing purposes, restitutive purposes, like helping their constitution, as it were, curing status ailments, right? These things. Now, we have some other people that are pretty good there. We see the scientists in the aides in the museums, the scientists that are aides inside of Professor Oak's lab. Some of them give you potions. Notice that this potion is not dominion or control over other Pokemon. It is actually your ability to heal your own. It forms this like symbiotic relationship. You can't fight the Pokemon yourself. Your Pokemon can, but you can help them by using potions, right? And these are things that are given to you, or Pokeballs to sometimes protect yourself, sometimes capture, and then either, depending on your perspective, hurt or help those Pokemon become stronger themselves. Now, there are some other examples of scientists that do really well for you in terms of technology synergizing. It's the aides in the museum, right? It's the scientists in the museum. When you go into the museum in Pewter City, you actually see this museum where you see a bunch of fossils and you see a rocket. You didn't think I was going to avoid that one, did you? You see a rocket, actually, that it confirms canonically that in the Kanto version of the Pokemon universe, you actually have canonical proof that you have been to the moon, or at least that a moon landing was attempted, right? We'll skip the rest of that conversation for now, but we'll come back to it. And so these people, all they do is they take a small amount of money in the context of the other things that you were told to pay for. 50 yen, 50 gold, 50 price, whatever you want to, $50, whatever you want to call it, whatever you regionalize it to in your brain. It's a very small amount of money for you to get Pokedex information. This is very good for you because it increases your scene on your scene or captured of your Pokedex. Notice that giving into this resource of the museum actually grows your Pokedex, which is itself a technological goal, right? The Pokedex is the completing the Pokedex is a synergy of the natural world and a technological goal of Professor Oak's, not by Dominion, but by interaction. And the museum actually fuels that, and the people inside of it are positive and interact with you in interesting and helpful ways throughout. Even the one that's a little bit mad that you came in through the back will give you an amber, the amber itself being something that was made in the natural world, but only has its benefit if it is reconstituted in a Pokemon lab on Cinnabar Island, which is part of the unnatural scientific technological world. All of these things are good synergies with one another. But there are other scientists in the game. There are other people that actually don't partake of this idea of synergy and use technology as a dominion over. And so we're going to talk about those NPCs as well. So we're going to talk about Bill. Yes, this is a take you haven't heard before. Bill is actually a representation of what happens when you are trying to win with science instead of working with the natural world. He is said by a super nerd inside of Mount Moon to be a Pokemaniac, right? As in maniacal, as in to past the point of reason and sense, past the point of just being invested or curious. We can see that Professor Oak deeply cares about Pokemon and takes his life's work very seriously, but there is almost a madness to what Bill does. For after all, the first time that we see him is the first hint that we get that actually this interaction between technology and Pokemon isn't always positive, and in fact, asserting the dominion of the technological world is a fool's errand and to the detriment of those who attempt it. For we all know what happens when we go inside of Bill's lab. Bill has actually mutated himself into a beast-like Pokemon. In the actual Gen 1 sprites, he has a similar sprite to, I believe, Rhydon in them. You know, where they're standing and they look all bulky and they're just like this. Yeah, there you go. Take that image. They're just doing this, right? He has actually attempted to use his device for teleportation, right, while working on the Pokemon transport system, and by using himself as a guinea pig has turned himself into something that is kind of a Pokemon, kind of not, like Full Metal Alchemist Chimera vibes here. And it's played off as something that you could just help him with, you know, you just press some buttons and he'll be fine over there. But notice where Bill lives. Bill lives deliberately on the outskirts of Cerulean City, in the farthest back right portion of that town, of that route, past Nugget Bridge, past a route of other trainers, people who claim that they're coming to go see Bill, but for the restrictions of the engine, never obviously go travel to see him. This isn't Poke MMO after all. And he's just left there until you're the one who fixes him, kind of the victim of his own scientific achievement. Yeah, he's got some Pokedex entries which show that he's redeemable. After all, he shows you some interesting new Pokemon that you can see but not have the information for, kind of piques your interest, expands your curiosity about the world, makes you understand that his collection in his Pokemaniacal status is something that you can use, but warns you against going too far in, for the technology itself has actually made him basically into a monster up until the point that you help him. Now let's look at all of the scientists that are rocket scientists. all of them have cold, demeaning, domineering attitudes, with the exception, and the scientist sprite itself looks harsh. They're hunched over. They got them Gendo Akari glasses looking on, telling you that they're not actually up to any good. You can't see their eyes. This is anime shorthand that we've known about for decades now, but if you can't see someone's eyes are the bridge into someone's soul. If you can't see their eyes, you can't see their soul, the implication is that they are hiding their intentions, or they are soulless, or they are not operating as a human. They are operating as a vessel for some greater purpose, some shenanigans, if you will. And there's only a couple of scientists who break this mold, and all of them are in Cinnabar Island. It's self-interesting because in the Cinnabar Island cave, the Cinnabar Island Pokelab, is another example of techno. This is actually an example of technology winning, and then technology existing, being dominant, having asserting its authority on the world of Kanto and Pokemon, and then actually nature is reclaiming it slowly. So if we look at, I mean, we're skipping all around over here, but we'll come back to some other examples. I'm just trying to give you a primer for how all these things go together, rather than spoon feed you one item at a time as to why that's the case. So if we look at the Pokelab, which is obviously what it was a research facility for creating Mewtwo, as we can see from the journal entries on Cinnabar Island. When we get there, it has the look of a place that is well organized, very formal in structure. We see statues as we come in, and a row that leans forward. We see dedicated statues that look like beast-type Pokemon, right? For the purpose of flipping switches. This is clearly a technological enterprise. You can almost feel the sterility inside of the entire area. Even the puzzle you have, such as it is, of where to go and how to go to get deeper in, is itself very technical. Key cards block the access down there. What else is inside of that lab? TMs. TMs themselves being an indication that this place has kind of come back from its dark past of being the place where Team Rocket and maybe Dr. Fuji, maybe, that's in the expanded universe. We can see, in greater games and tie-ins and spin-ons, or spin-offs, we can see that he was actually there. But there's no indication hard, at least in the English translated version from all of the reading that I've done, that he was there specifically. But obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, this is where Mewtwo was made. This is where the experiments were made. In the first game, Mew gave birth, and then they did horrible gene splicing experiments, as per Mewtwo's Pokedex entry, to go ahead and create Mewtwo. But something went wrong, didn't it? It was too vicious to control. And now you don't see rockets in that building anymore. You see TMs, which are actually kind of the merit. TMs as an item are an interaction between Pokemon and technology, in a way that HMs aren't, right? TMs are things that you can give a Pokemon. You can only use it one time, and you can replace or overwrite the TM, the technical machine. Now, you could say that this is for game balance reasons. You could say this is because they didn't think about it very much, that it's only a one-time use. But it's kind of interesting that it has a cost benefit, right? It encourages you to think carefully about what you're giving Thunderbolt, what you're giving Earthquake, or Horn Drill, or Psychic, these kinds of TMs, right? And a TM, because it can be overwritten, is less domineering, it is less punch-downy than something like an HM or a hidden machine, which once you give to a Pokemon, the Pokemon cannot overwrite it, cannot forget it. And you could say the purpose of this is that actually we don't want Pokemon to just forget Surf and leave you stranded somewhere because you deposited the item. I'm sure that's the real reason, but it's just interesting to note in this lens that the TMs that are inside of that island are less offensive, less pervasive, less potent than the HMs that you might find elsewhere. You see people that are in there, and all of the Pokemon that are there are themselves a fusion of what was in the normal or natural world and an affected science. So here's a couple of examples of where that's the case on that very island in that lab. Ditto, very famous, pink-looking blob Pokemon, similar weight and the same type of stat distribution as Mew. Obviously, Mew is 100s across the board, across all five of its stats in Gen 1. Ditto, 47 across. Mew learns any ability, Ditto can learn anything courtesy of its transform ability. It doesn't take a lot of lateral thinking to realize that Ditto appears to be a failed clone of Mew in this instance. What else is on that island or in that area? Grimer and Muck, Pokemon that are attracted to toxic sludge, Pokemon that reproduce in areas that are created basically by corporate runoff, as we see in the small surfable patch that you can have and the encounters you can get inside of Celadon City. But there are other Pokemon there too, aren't there? There are some of the very few fire types in Kanto that live there. A nod to the fact that Blaine is present, but also that there's more to this place than it just being a dump, a place where nothing exists anymore except the remnants of a science gone horribly wrong. So even inside of this lab, this ruined area, that still shows the effects of science having won, science having been dominant, science having been the thing that was being like harmful in this area. We can still see remnants of natural life that are in the area. In this way, it actually shares a lot of similarities to a place where there's actually a more seamless integration of science and nature. The ruined, the exiled, the old power plant off the coast, in the upper right-hand portion of the map where you can find Zapdos. In fact, let's get into that because the legendary birds themselves are an excellent, they speak to this idea of science and nature meeting one another. Before we get into how one is better than the other, we look at Articuno. This is the dark side of nature, actually. Articuno only visits those who are about to die, it says in its Pokemon Pokedex entry. And where does it live? In the bottom of the sea foam caverns, a place with no NPCs, inhospitable to life that you have to find yourself. One of the few like true serious dungeons, for the prize at the bottom is greater than any story beat. It is a mythical, it is a legendary Pokemon. It is a thing with 90% accurate blizzards in Gen 1. Like, this is a monstrously powerful Pokemon. Then we look at Moltres. Moltres is in Victory Road, and Moltres actually, instead of only showing to doomed people, as seems to be the case for Articuno, Moltres has canonically shown itself to Blaine. It has an interaction as a Pokemon, as a representative of the natural world, with Blaine, who is kind of one of the people upholding the human portion of this world. It makes its home in Victory Road, a place that seems to be a natural cave structure and formation, but is nevertheless used as a super gauntlet leading into the Elite Four, a place where nature has completely disavowed and been torn asunder and sent aside in favor of the human construction of the Elite Four and the Champion and all of those more mechanical items. But Moltres lives inside of this area, a natural formation that is nevertheless used by people who are using technology, who are working alongside their Pokemon. And then the final place actually is Zapdos, whose home is entirely in a place that was formed from the ground up by technology. It is literally a power plant. It is meant for the whole purpose of doing nothing but generating things for humans and human facilities. It is now a home to a plethora of electric-type Pokemon. Right? Even curiously home to a ton of Voltorbs and Electrodes, Pokemon themselves that show that actually the attempt to show dominion over the natural world with Pokemon is itself failed, for even then the Pokemon will adapt to them in kind. Notice how Voltorb is actually a clever take on the mimic idea of other JRPGs, but also it canonically makes sense that it would want to look like a Pokeball, the technology that is used to capture it as a means of camouflage. I mean, we see more of this camouflage in later Pokemon generations, but we'll go on from there. But so how is technology actually? I've shown some examples where technology is bad. Some NPCs are bad. Some examples in which it works well together with other people. And some examples where, like Articuno's Seafoam Caverns, where actually the absence of technology is itself not good. Think about Viridian Forest the first time you go in Viridian Forest. Low-level Pokemon, giant dungeon, not a map to show you how to get through things. Pretty simple, obviously, if you're us, if you're my age, if you've played through these games the first time around, you played through the remakes that you're currently in, right? You're not getting lost in Viridian Forest. If you're a speedrunner, you know the tiles in Gen 1 you can stand on so that you don't run into encounters. But think about it. It is a giant canopy of nature. Trees cover the entire area and give it a dimness very similar to the Ilex Forest, which itself is part of Gen 2's theme, but we'll get into that maybe in a separate video. And what is inside of there? Bug catchers. People who they just want. Why are their Pokemon so weak? Why do they just have the bugs that are naturally around? Because that is the embodiment of nature. Having Pokemon that are in that area only, and having it be a giant and confusing maze of locations with false paths and strange avenues to go, where you can be tackled and poisoned, and you can run out of time and energy and run out of Pokemon, and your health gets dwindled down and you don't know where to go and you have few items to help you navigate this dungeon. That's what nature looks like in the Pokemon world if it is left uncontested. It looks like, in fact, on purpose, it looks like Cerulean Cave itself, a place so fearsome and mighty that an NPC literally stops you from going there ahead of time, maybe as a balancing act. If we're taking a Holmesian, if we're taking a Doyleist perspective, but if we're taking a Watsonian perspective, this is where nature has gone and run amok, where you actually need the full prowess, the proof of your power from the human world, and the extant technologies that it has provided to overcome the challenges of that area. Viridian Forest, the Seafoam Cavern, Cerulean Cave, these are all what happens when nature wins, and it's not any more positive. But that's not the focus of the game, is it? The focus of the game is why technology itself is the thing that should not be the leader going into the future. So, who better to represent that, obviously, than Team Rocket? More than the gyms, more than the dungeons themselves, more than the catch rates, more than the disparity between TMs and HMs, more than the Pokemon or how they mingle together. All of these things, right? The fact that Mewtwo and Ditto show that science wins, the fact that Porygon exists, I'm just looking through a list here, the way that Dragonite and Cloyster and Doduo actually overcome their own challenges, and all of these interactions like Primeape, none of those actually showcase what I'm talking about here with technology being the false way to lead more than Team Rocket itself. Remember how I said we were going to talk about how the moon and the canonical landing on the moon was very important for the Pokemon series, important for Kanto in the context of this one game, right? Well, it is. So, Team Rocket, it is not an accident that a number of things go together to show that Team Rocket is the vessel for showing why unadulterated technology, arguably in pursuit of profit, arguably in pursuit of their own agenda, as we'll find out with Giovanni, is not a positive thing. So, it's very important to note that in this universe, in Gen 1, the moon landing did happen. Rockets did go up. And it is not it kind of primes you when you see that the landing happened and that there is the same rocket as our real world in the museum, that the enemy team is called Team Rocket. We get a little bit of a hint of Team Rocket. After all, they're in Mount Moon. Some of them are looking for rare fossils. Think of that. They're looking for rare fossils. Fossils are a thing in nature, can only be brought back up by the use of technology. But what is the goal of the rocket that you fight in there? It is to sell them. It is to sell them to make money in some way. But why else would they be in there? Well, let's think about this. Team Rocket, I mean, the rocket actually has sent to the moon. If you read the Pokedex entries for Clefairy, it said that they came from the moon. We're not even talking about the anime-only epilepsy-inducing nightmare episode where they have the Clefairy have their own spaceship and can move forward. But there's other references to Pokemon that look towards the moon or pay attention. Gengar looks at the moon in the full night. The Mount Moon itself, the fragments of the moon, or said to be fragments of the moon, are necessary for the evolution of Pokemon that are explicitly said to come from the moon itself. Now, whether this is myth and lore as befits the Pokedex, I don't think so, as we'll get into going on. And so, Team Rocket, the rocket being how you get to the moon, we first find them in Mount Moon, and then we think about a couple of other interesting things. If Pokemon did come from the moon, wouldn't that explain why Giovanni specifically has a Nidoqueen, a Pokemon that can only be evolved by the use of a Moonstone, an external thing? Wouldn't it be interesting that he has a Pokemon that requires the use of a Moonstone when his team's name is Team Rocket? But anyways, going forward, how else does Team Rocket show that they're a bit up to no good and that technology is bad? Well, we can look at this. Here's something most people don't put together, they don't think about, because they don't think of Giovanni as a real antagonist, because the game doesn't throw the monsters in your face the way that it does in, say, Gen 3, where, hey, Kyogre's just going to kill everything because Team Aqua messed it up, right? They don't do that. So let's get into a few other ways that Team Rocket shows their underhanded ways and demonstrates this idea that technology is not the progress that we actually need going forward. If you go to Cerulean City, you can find that there's a Team Rocket grunt with a Drowsy. This is interesting. He is not only one of the few trainers with Psychic-type Pokemon in there, but remember what I said about Drowsy? Drowsy evolves into Hypno. It is a bipedal thing. People are supposed to be Psychic, and here's a Rocket with a Psychic-type Pokemon. But think about this. This is a brilliant piece of world building most people don't think about. That Team Rocket grunt stole TM28. He stole Dig. Now, why would he want Dig and a Psychic-type Pokemon? Well, I can think of a few reasons. If Team Rocket created Mewtwo, as it appears that they did based on what we see in Cinnabar Island, then it would make sense that a Rocket would want Dig, for after all, only the league champion is allowed to go in Cerulean Cave. But if you could Dig, not in-game mechanics to get out of a dungeon and then go back to a Poke Center, but to do the opposite, to burrow down in and then enter a dungeon, wouldn't it make sense that you would want to be able to use Dig to get into Celadon or Cerulean Cave? Wouldn't it make sense then to have a Psychic-type Pokemon as a resistance to Mewtwo itself? The entire purpose here is that the Rocket attacked an individual and stole a TM that was meant for the purpose of Pokemon and technology working together, for the purpose of going ahead and using that technology to go and attack another Pokemon, in this case specifically Mewtwo. 1 second while I look up something. Do-do-do. Doodle-doo, do-do-do, doodle-doo, do-do-do, doodle-doo, do-do-do, do-do-do, do-do-do. Lest you think that that was all some bit of fun, as you could probably see me look up right then, the only Pokemon that Rocket had is a Drowsy. Drowsy can't learn Dig. That Rocket cannot use Dig to teach it to their Drowsy. So they have a Psychic-resistant Pokemon that also involves them stealing a piece of technology for Team Rocket that he himself cannot use. Sounds like it all points back to Mewtwo, yeah? In fact, Mewtwo is kind of the centerpiece of this idea that technology is bad. But we'll keep going on. Where else do you encounter the Rockets? Well, obviously, if you don't use the PokeDoll trick, it's the PokeDoll itself, by the way, being a brilliant example of how technology and Pokemon can work together without being superordinate over the other. Because obviously you could just use it to escape the Marowak, but that's the most common use. But usually in-game you can use it to run from any one Pokemon as kind of a one-time get-out-of-jail. Right, you drop a substitute item that just gets you out of it. Interesting bit of the game working together with its messaging there. But the next place you see them is Celadon. Now, Celadon is a place itself that has Grimers, Pokemon that are made purely from and reproduce around toxic sludge and the mess therein. Yes, oh, it's just a sludge with eyes. It's like, well, that's actually part of the world building here, is that, yes, the impact that the human world has had on nature is that nature adapts by having Pokemon that reproduce based off of the failures of humanity and their uncontrolled excesses when it comes to technology, here represented as corporations in Celadon. Now, this is also shown as to be a good thing for the player, because one of the brilliant parts of Celadon is that it has the huge shopping center, and you'll love that as a player. Very few wild encounters. You have to be on those water tiles to actually see them, but you can shop and buy anything you want. Isn't this why technology is so great? Team Rocket is there to show the underside of why technology is actually not so great. also Eevee, the other encounter that is there, is itself a subtle indication of this is what happens when you try and mess with things a bit too far. Also, for the more curious and observant people, you might note that Eevee can only be given away, and that the people who were interested in Eevee, according to the owner, were none other than Team Rocket themselves. Now, why would Team Rocket be interested in a Pokemon who, according to the Pokedex entry, has a genetic code that is unstable and as a result does not live very long? Does this sound familiar to you? Does it? And actually, how even does Eevee evolve? It evolves through the use of stones that you can't find naturally in the world of Kanto. You can only purchase them. So only through the use of technology can you actually keep this Pokemon that itself is kind of an aberration of nature alive and well. But we see other aberrations of nature or things that are outside the material world entirely, courtesy of Team Rocket here. Look at the Pokemon that Team Rocket gives you in the game corner. Yes, there's Scyther, but yes, there's Abra, yes, there's Dratini, but there's also Porygon, one of the only places you can get Porygon, in fact. Porygon being a Pokemon that exists entirely inside of cyberspace and may be able to go specifically, may be able to fly to the moon. Very curious that Team Rocket would want to create a completely cybernet, like a cyberspace Pokemon that has specifically flight capabilities and might be able to take them to the moon, which, again, if you follow the little tendrils here of there might be some truth to the idea that Pokemon originate from the moon, you also get a deeper sense of Giovanni's makeup, which is this. Pokemon to Giovanni and Team Rocket are tools meant to be used and exploited. But if they don't think that Pokemon are part of the natural order, because they did come from the moon, and they're named Team Rocket, I think they would look into this a little bit, and their owner's activities in Giovanni seem suspiciously aligned to that reality, then you can see that what they're actually doing is, it's not an accident. They're not just trying to make money because they're somewhat the bad guys. Team Rocket actually wants dominion over Pokemon, because it is implied somewhat subtly. They don't see them as being part of the natural world. They are not meant to be treated as equals, to cohabitate with, to rise together, to integrate with. They're meant to be stopped because they're basically a virus. But if you look at what else Team Rocket has in there, they use their amazing technology. They use as a front for gambling, right? Well, they actually use a gambling and casino as a front for other activities that they take inside of Celadon itself. So all of these things are obviously these pachinko style parlors, these slot machines, these one-armed bandits are themselves a technology, but one that's not used for dominion over Pokemon. Oh no, they're actually used for dominion over people by by preying on their psychology and playing tricks upon the human beings themselves, depriving them of their money. The only place that you can get coins in the entire game to get those very rare Pokemon, one of which entirely created, it would appear, by Team Rocket, or aligns suspiciously closely to their goals, is by basically getting extorted for all of these coins on a randomizer that you have very little, if no, control over, barring you just being one of those people who's like, anyways, we're just going to use a action replay equivalent here, just auto win all of these. I mean, I bet people who play TASes would love to just tell me I'm wrong about that, but for the average player experience, they are getting exploited by Team Rocket for a bit of cheap fun and thrills with the allure of prizes that they cannot get. And it is strongly suggested that all of these things done in this casino, done in this like one-armed bandit parlor, are meant for the purpose of giving more money and funds and ability to Team Rocket themselves. It is actually inside of Celadon that we have our first run-in with, of all people, Giovanni, but it's not too clear what's going on in Celadon itself. So let's skip Team Rocket there and go to Team Rocket elsewhere. The next place we see Team Rocket, barring a couple randomized trainers here and there, is actually in a place that we would least expect it, right? We actually see them in the Pokemon Tower. Right? Now, this is very curious. We see channelers in the Pokemon Tower. This itself being a place where Pokemon are who have died, which doesn't happen in the game to you, but I mean, you could say it happens to Gary's Raticate, to Blue's Raticate, your rival's Raticate, but whatever, right? 1 second. Yeah. So Basically, in Lavender Town, once you go up the Pokemon Tower, you actually see this curious interaction. Remember how I said that humans are psychic in the Pokemon universe? And in the Kanto universe, this is seen as a natural part of their progression, that psychic Pokemon become more human-like. This is even a very subtle indication if you're willing to stretch far enough. If you look at the fact that the precursor to Pokemon in this timeline, in this generation, is Mew, that has the genetic makeup of nearly every Pokemon, that it itself is psychic, that Sabrina says that everyone has psychic powers, that psychic Pokemon overwhelmingly are more tool using, are more integrated with, and are more bipedal than their counterparts in the Pokemon universe. You could even say that the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town is another indication of this, for all of the channelers are possessed in some way by these ghost Pokemon. But as you go up, this is a place that is made for an understanding of the natural world, an uncomfortable but deeply real aspect of it, which is that Pokemon died. This is where people go to pay their respects. The bottom floor is filled with tombstones. The lining of bricks kind of moves along. All of the trainers you fight aren't actually trainers. They're more channelers, right? There's not very many people in there trying to pick a fight with you in a cemetery. All of the people that are there are actually just possessed by one, sometimes more than one, actually, ghost Pokemon that wish to, then it is implied by winning, possess you, but they are unable to do that, and the channelers thank you for freeing them. This is another indication of how the natural world can be a bit scary, very similar to what we talked about with Viridian Forest and Cerulean Cave, and to a lesser extent the Seafoam Islands. It's implied that not all Pokemon are friendly to you, and that this is not just a cute world of itself, but these things do have means and wish, in the case of these ghost Pokemon, to possess you. For whatever purpose, who can say? Probably a larger topic for a different video. Now, what's interesting once you get to the top there is that there is a ghost there, the ghost of the Marowak, and you can only see it through the the Silph scope. The Silph scope being another example of how the natural world, right, seeing how the natural world integrates with technology in a comfortable way, and we can see how Giovanni's influence Team Rocket's actually attempt to pervert that equilateral nature, right, or that equitable nature. And so the Silph scope by itself just allows you to do one thing. It allows you to see the ghosts of the Mother Marowak. The Mother Marowak itself stopping anyone from continuing up the tower because it hates Team Rocket for killing its child. This is what the Pokedex entry indicates. And also you can only get one take at this thing, so it says that it peacefully passes away. The Silph scope is meant to allow you to see that. But if we go back to the ulterior motives of Team Rocket here, why would Team Rocket want, of all things, the Silph scope? Well, the Silph scope allows them to see ghosts and perceive them, but more importantly in gameplay mechanics, it means that your Pokemon aren't so frightened of them that they don't attack. Now, due to a coding error, actually, in Gen 1 Pokemon, Ghost was supposed to be super effective against Psychic. We know that that's not what ended up happening. But if you understand that the game programmers and the story writers didn't mean for that to be the case, we get an interesting subset here of Team Rocket's motivation. While the Silph Scope itself is a piece of technology meant to identify ghosts and allow Pokemon to work with them, in this case to put the Mother Marowak to rest, which is seen as not only a good idea, but a plot necessary element for things to continue on. And this is also why I believe, personally, my personal take, it's actually exactly in the spirit of the game that you can give the PokeDoll to the ghost without identifying it, and it goes on to rest as well. Just as the Silph Scope is a piece of technology that identifies the Pokemon so you can interact with it, the PokeDoll is a piece of technology that allows the enemy Pokemon to recognize it as such and have a battle and then therefore go to rest. And so I don't think that that's actually a bug or an abuse. I'm so glad that speedruns allow that. But think about it. Giovanni, again, Team Rocket thinks that these things come from the moon. These things are not, are invasive to some extent. And so they want the Silph Scope because it allows them to catch a ghost Pokemon that can have complete domination over Mewtwo, itself a child of Mew, a child of the natural world that they then tortured through science to create. That's at least canonical to the Pokedex entry in Gen 1 Pokemon itself. And so why is Team Rocket there? Because they want the Mother Marowak. they want ghost Pokemon. And as you go up there, there is no less than a cadre, a group of Team Rocket grunts that you then beat. The only trainers who actually fight, all of the other trainers are respectful of the fact that this is a place of the natural order of death, of things that are to pass on, and they do not disturb the rest of those entities. Even the other trainers you fight inside of the Pokemon Tower are themselves channelers who are possessed. Their respect for the natural world being so great, they actually show the dangers of not putting on your guard, of not integrating science and nature, but actually just letting nature run rampant, and are kind of showing you that, yes, there is a means and a power for those things to actually be overcome. Team Rocket, however, are actively hostile towards you and attempt to beat you all the way up until you go to see Mr. Fuji. Now, obviously, in the expanded universe and the spin-offs, we have this extra little wrinkle, this extra little, we even see it in the trailers they did for Gen 6. We'll get to that in a bit, but Gen 6 is basically Gen 1's story again, because Pokemon people. We'll just talk, we'll tie this in a bow and then we'll come back to it, right? But basically, every 5 generations, Pokemon goes back to the same wellspring of story, because actually the theme of what is progress goes in a cycle itself as people figure out what they want. Very, very, very quickly, TLDR. Gen 1, we think that science is how we go forward. It's not. Gen 2, we think that history is what we look to for progress. It's not. 3, we think that nature is what we look to for progress. It's not. 4, we say, oh, if it's not science, if it's not our history, if it's not our technology, and if it's not it coexisting with what things are, then obviously we need to just have, we need to create a new structure, like a Nietzsche style, like create a new mentality. And that doesn't work. And then Gen 5 says, fuck it. If we can't create a new mentality, nature doesn't work, integration doesn't work, technology doesn't work, our past isn't good enough, fuck all of this, we'll just blow it all up and start again. And then actually, it turns out you can't do that without its own repercussions. And so once people realize they can't blow everything up, they go back to trying to improve the status quo, which means we go back to the loop of science. But anyways, we'll get into those videos later on. So basically, after you do this, Mount Fuji goes back and he gives you something interesting. Remember, canonically, in the expanded universe, he actually helped Team Rocket do these studies, and we can see that he is like basically participated in the evils of science. And what is his reformation? What is his means of going back from the world and then fixing what went wrong? Not only do we see him up in the Pokemon Tower, a contrast to Team Rocket, trying to put the spirit of the Mother Marowak at peace, not through domination or as an act of war or to use it for some nefarious purpose of itself greater domination, but actually trying to integrate what he knows and kind of to make peace with the things he had done. He gives you a piece of technology. He gives you the PokeFlute. Now, the PokeFlute is very interesting because the only other tools that we have inside of Gen 1 that you can use over and over and over and over and over and over and over, notice that they're all technology. The bicycle is actually a means not of domination, but of you coexisting with the world and navigating it a bit faster. Permanent use item. Other permanent use item, right? So that's kind of like an integration of the two. The bicycle is pretty good integration. The next one, HMs. I know for game reasons they had to make it so you couldn't just like drop your HM and then your Pokemon can't use Surf and etc. But the impact of the effect of HMs in game is that they supersede the desires of the Pokemon. It is actually technology dominating nature in this sense. For an HM cannot be forgotten by a Pokemon in the same way that a TM can. Now you might say that's good so we can't soft lock pick ourselves, but at the same time that just means you can't escape the impact of these hidden machines. They are dominant. They are pressing on the volition and the free will of the Pokemon themselves to learn or to forget a move. But the PokeFlute is neither of those. All the PokeFlute does is it says there is a thing that naturally happens that you find deleterious, and we're going to make sure that that deleterious effect doesn't occur. Right? It also has the game design benefit of freeing up bag space and making awakenings like not as relevant, and then it just makes your inventory more powerful, and it basically grows your technology stack. So instead of these suboptimal awakenings or just waiting to fight through Gen 1 sleep mechanics, you can just use this item. But it also helps you. It shows in two ways. It's a very multifaceted item for this thesis, which is that the PokeFlute itself wakes the sleeping Snorlax. Now, Snorlax is a natural phenomenon, right? This is also proof that nature by itself is not good. For nature by itself has generated this thing, this Snorlax, that will not leave. And the problem with that is that there's no force that can overcome that by being nice. You can't just shake the hand of it and solve it. It actually represents a literal roadblock on your journey that can only be overcome by science, that can only be overcome by technology. But its gameplay impact after that is to give you something that you would naturally want that isn't harmful and isn't your expression of dominion itself. And so he actually, like, this is all the ways that Team Rocket has shown you this, that technology being bad is a thing, but also that Mount Fuji has shown, not Mount Fuji, Mr. Fuji, like the Pokemon guy, has shown that you can work these things together. Next part that we see Team Rocket working as they show this is perhaps the if you don't fucking get it, we're telling it to you now of the story, is Silphco, right? What is the purpose of Silphco? What's going on here? Well, obviously Giovanni is working towards capturing Mewtwo again, right? He paid a lot of money for this. Mewtwo blew up a lab. His plans to get more money have been shut down in Celadon. His plans to get the Dig TM so he can just tunnel his ground-based Pokemon into Cerulean Cave and go challenge Mewtwo directly has been stopped. You literally stopped him from getting a ghost Pokemon that's immune to Mewtwo's effects, you fucking asshole. So this is it. This is the game telling you technology, bad. Why? Silphco is a mega dungeon. It is a mega dungeon, but unlike the dungeon of the power plant, unlike the dungeon of the Seafoam Caverns, unlike the dungeon of Victory Road, this is a purely mechanical, corporate, no random encounters, absence of nature. There are no wild Pokemon inside of Silphco. It is a corporation specifically that works on, get this, again, if you think this is an accident, I got nothing for you. Silphco specifically is a corporation that works and is multi-level one and the largest dungeon in the game, and it specifically is working on a technology to 100% of the time capture a Pokemon without fail in the Master Ball. It is actually the pure domination over the natural world of technology. And this is obviously something that Giovanni wants, because a thing that can catch without fail would not only be great to mass produce, but it would also mean that it could catch Mewtwo. All of the scientists in here tell you basically they're glad they're evil and that they work for Team Rocket, and they're so happy they don't have to work with Silphco anymore. They've gone from domination by their takeover of this corporate building. Team Rocket shows they not only have contempt for the natural world, they also have contempt for human beings that work in said natural world itself. The tiles and the means that you move around Silphco are itself, first off, it is blocked by a series of key cards and access pathways, and then you can't actually just go up to the floor you want and continue. It has warp tiles all over the place. Remember how Sabrina said that, everyone is psychic, and she herself, by being the psychic type trainer that beat the fighting type, that was a natural progression, but it is shown that actually being psychic is itself a progress that human beings are naturally working towards. You could say it's a technology, but it's like a natural technology, which is a bit of an oxymoron, right? But what's happening here that's so fascinating is that when you get through corporate structure, key cards blocking everything, there's even people you have to physically beat yourself. You have to dominate them in order to get the cards necessary for you to unlock this labyrinthine area. All of the places inside of here, again, no natural encounters. Even the means by which you move through is deliberately disorienting and requires you to have a map and wander around aimlessly, because it is a corporate structure, right? It is, if Viridian Forest were hit by the chrome future that Squidward goes into in that episode of SpongeBob, future, this is what it would look like. The only person who shows you any kindness inside of Silphco is actually your rival, who just doesn't care about the rest of this at all. And the one gentleman who is afraid for what will happen and so gives you his Lapras, a highly intelligent Pokemon that allows you to surf across the sea, right? But when you get there in Silphco, you can see that obviously this place, even if itself it is not evil per se, all of its actions orient towards the domination of the natural world. They're not making Pokeballs or Great Balls or Ultra Balls. They're making Master Balls that prevent these things from happening. Yes, they also made the Silph Scope so that you could see ghosts, but you could also use the technology of seeing ghosts to dominate them, crush them, and force them to be captured under your heel, right? This is in contrast to things like the Pokemon Tower, where there are wild encounters. This is a barren landscape of pure technology. And that is actually what he is after. That's what Giovanni is after. That's what Team Rocket is after. Which is funny because the whole thing is about him being after Mewtwo. Mewtwo itself being a demonstration of the folly of trying to dominate the natural world with science and how it's ultimately doomed to failure. Yes, just because there's not a giant legendary swooping in off the box art to have a cutscene to tell you this doesn't mean that that's not the case. And the final way that this ends up for Giovanni is that not only is he defeated in his normal habitat as a gym leader and all of his plans have gone to waste and he disappears, but technology takes one more L, as it were. It takes one more beating. I mean, we obviously already showed what happens. The last of the three birds you can encounter, think about it, you can encounter in order Zapdos, who is pure technology, right? You can encounter Articuno next, who is pure nature, and then the last bird you can encounter is the equilibrium between the two. It is a wildfire natural beast in its natural habitat that is also cohabitated by humans in Victory Road, Moltres. But just in case you didn't get it, right? Just in case it missed the gates that you have to go through to get into the gates you have to go through after all the rival beatings and whatnot that you have to go through all require not technology. They require the synthesis of technology and scientific extension and Pokemon. You have to surf through areas to get through the later gyms. Right, there is a human there, not a gate system, a human who is checking to make sure that you have all of these things as you go forward. And once you get into this place, this Elite Four, this giant combine that seems to be of technology, it's not. Unlike the harshness of Silphco, there are natural encounters outside in Victory Road and in the area leading up to. In fact, you can encounter Firo outside of Victory Road itself. Once you get in there, there is technology used purely to augment you. There's Poke Centers, so you can heal all of your Pokemon. There's the Pokemon Box system, which allows you to manipulate and orient your Pokemon, but not to capture or steal them. It just allows you to organize what you have. There's a bunch of single-use items in there so that you can heal and assist your Pokemon, right? But none of these things will win the Elite Four challenge for you. None of these things will actually be responsible for your victory. It is the integration of the two. And just in case you thought Team Rocket had a point, just in case you thought that technology might be the way to go into the future, just in case you thought that the dominion over the natural world was of greater value than working with it, and in case you ignored the lessons that Professor Oak has by his very existence and the way he shows Pokemon and the introduction of the game, just in case you didn't quite get that nature itself is scary in Viridian Forest, but science itself is scary in Silphco, and that you need both of them. Mewtwo, the legendary that isn't on the box art, right? The box art legendary that wasn't. This thing that is born naturally and then manipulated by science and attended to all these horrible purposes. Once you beat the Elite Four, you can go find it in Cerulean Cave, the final cave of nature itself. In case you thought that technology was all bad, here's Cerulean Cave to show what happens if you have all nature. It is only with the abilities that you have generated, the technology that you have gathered, that you can actually go down there. And what's the pièce de résistance, the final irony? What is the thing that I think canonically happens at the end of the game, if you're playing it properly, if you're following all of these things? You, the person who is attempting to realize that nature is not the only way forward and science is not the only way forward. Technology is not the only thing, but that actually the path to the future has to be different. There's no cutscene. There's nothing sexy that happens. Game end over credits already occurred when you beat the Elite Four and the champion. But the actual canonical ending of the game to me is that once you go down into the nature mega dungeon that is Celadon Cave or Cerulean Cave, you use the Master Ball to catch Mewtwo. This thing that only exists because of science is thus most easily contained by science. So in all of this final bow, you realize that actually the ultimate goal here is not for science to supplant nature. And it is not to abdicate our responsibility to try and improve the world around us. But perhaps the best use of science, the best use of technology, in addition to augmenting ourselves alongside these other items, is to use it to control science that has gone too far. Thank you so much. I'll be doing another one of these for Gen 2 and onward. Just as a quick teaser, the theme of Gen 2 is that history is not the means forward. And that'll sound obvious, but there's a lot of ways that Gen 2 goes in and specifically subverts the expectation. So think about this as we get into that video. If you think of the Pokemon games as talking about how we're going to move forward into the future, what light, what path, how should we orient ourselves in the world, by what can we stick our Polaris, our North Star? Once you realize that science, a thing that naturally synergizes with progress and sends things onward and upward, isn't necessarily the guiding light. It is most natural to look to its antithesis, to look to history. And surprisingly, history gets you farther in different ways than science, than technology, but it doesn't actually solve the main problems of how you get forward, period. But we'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you so much for your time.